Okay, thank you all for having me here with you today. As you just heard, my name is Stacy Schaffer, and I am the founder of 31A Project. And we're an organization that works with to educate others on the topic of human trafficking. I also work with Lutheran Social Services and University of Mary's Demand Reduction Program and the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force. So it's possible you might have seen me in one of those different settings as well. So to start with today, I just want to share a short video with you to share a little bit information about what does a case of human trafficking look like, but also share a little bit information about who 31A Project is.
When I was 16, I began dating an older man named James, and he was in his late 20s. When I first met James, I was really excited. He was good looking, and he treated me like an adult. And he even bought me really expensive gifts. He told me that he would always care about me. But after a few months, things started to change. He was short on money and he wasn't able to make his rent, and so he had an idea of how I could help. And that idea was to sleep with his friend for money. He told me that if I really cared about him and loved him, that I would do it. And it was only supposed to be one time, but that time turned into multiple times. Soon, James, he wouldn't let me see any of my friends, and he distanced me from my family, and he became abusive, both mentally and physically. I felt like I had nowhere to go, and I was ashamed of what I had done. It's hard to imagine that someone that I thought loved me could use me in that way.
Human trafficking is a $150 billion industry worldwide. In 2017, an estimated 1 out of 7 endangered runaways reported were likely child sex trafficking victims. It is estimated that 600,000 to 800,000 people are trafficked in the United States annually. A third of all human trafficking cases are reported by the general public. Since January 1, 2016, the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force has served 242 victims. In North Dakota, human trafficking has occurred in large cities as well as rural communities. My name is Stacy Schaffer, and I'm the founder of 31A Project. 31A Project works to equip and challenge society to proactively address issues regarding human trafficking, starting right here in North Dakota. I first started my work in combating human trafficking in 2006. The first case I ever worked on dealt with a little girl named Anna, who was 8 years old and was trafficked from El Salvador to a brothel in Guatemala. While in the brothel, men came in and sexually assaulted Anna over and over and over again. Anna's cries were heard outside, and somebody called for help. When help arrived, they were able to take Anna to a shelter where she was able to receive services. Many people might see Anna's story as a story of tragedy, but we see it as a story of success, as Anna was able to survive to share her story. It was her story that gave me the inspiration to start 31A Project, which comes from Proverbs 31:8, speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. We truly believe that through education, we will be able to equip our communities to help report and identify this hidden crime. We also have realized that the general public serves as the eyes and the ears of the community. If they don't have the education on what human trafficking looks like, how do we begin to combat this problem? Our organization is honored to partner with and educate schools, faith-based groups, the medical community, law enforcement, and other organizations. The stories you heard are just 2 examples out of the millions of cases of human trafficking happening throughout the world, including North Dakota. Now it is up to you to create a community that is ready to take action against this crime.
Open your eyes and speak up. Human trafficking is happening here in North Dakota, and you can do something about it. And that starts with getting educated and sharing 318 Project's message.
So that's a little bit more about who we are as an organization. At any point today, if you have any questions or need some clarity about what I'm talking about, please feel free to interject at any time. I'm also going to be sharing some cases with you. Some of the information can kind of be hard to hear, but I want you to know I'm not doing it to scare you by any means. I just want you to really understand what human trafficking looks like here in the state of North Dakota. So today, really, we're going to define what we mean by human trafficking, identify what are red indicators, as well as red flags in identifying a potential victim as well as trafficker. And then, of course, what do you do next if you believe you may have encountered a case of human trafficking? So just to gauge, to get a better understanding of the room, how many people are familiar with the topic of human trafficking? Okay, this is great. Would you say you have a little bit of knowledge about it, or you're well versed in it? What would you say? And feel free to shout it out. General? Okay. So hopefully, if it's just a general knowledge that you have, that today you'll be able to leave with more knowledge on the topic. So when we talk about human trafficking, it can really be broken down into two categories: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Now, we have victims that have definitely fallen into both categories. They may have been forced to work in a restaurant during the day and sold for sex acts at night. That can happen, but generally they'll fall into either that sex trafficking or labor trafficking category. Now, when we look at how do we determine a case of human trafficking, it typically involves force, fraud, or coercion. Now, if it's a minor, you do not need those elements present, but if it's somebody that's over the age of 18, you do need force, fraud, and coercion to be present in order for it to be a case of human trafficking. So where does human trafficking occur? Anywhere, and we truly mean that. I know people want to know exactly where is this taking place. I know social media has played a big role in trafficking today, but I'll give an example of before I moved back to North Dakota, I was part of the Minnesota Human Trafficking Task Force. And we had a case where there was a trafficker who had been trafficking young girls around the age of 14 to go into local schools and traffic additional people. So this 14-year-old went into this middle school and she befriended another girl. And she was really adamant about having her stay overnight at her house. Well, this other girl's parents were really pushing back and said, you know, we don't let you stay at anybody's house when we don't know the parents. So the girl who was being trafficked, she arranged for her dad to meet her dad, who was her trafficker. He was posing as a single parent, just trying to make ends meet. So this girl's parents met the single father, and everything seemed to look okay. And so they gave their daughter the permission to stay at this individual's house. So that was a Friday night. That Saturday morning, they woke up, and a lot of times I think we just have that feeling, that gut feeling when something seems off. And they did. And they called over to the house. Nobody answered, so they drove over to the house, and once they got there, the house was abandoned, and their daughter was gone. Now, is every case like that? No, definitely not. Our cases look different. Each case looks a little different, in fact, but that's just one example of how we do see trafficking even occurring in our schools as well. So when we look at some statistics and the demand of this, I want to just have you think about this for a second. What would you say the value of your life is? Like if somebody was willing to purchase you today, what would you be willing to sell yourself for? Right, it's hard to think about. $1.79. There you go. There you go. That's one amount. Some people might say priceless. Some people might, say $1 million. It's a really hard question to answer. But what do you think the average person sold into slavery is sold for today, on average? What? Close. I'm not sure where that came from. But the average person sold into slavery is sold for roughly $90 today. That's crazy to think about. I would say I definitely value my life higher than $90, and I think majority of you would say the same. Now, have we had people sold for lower prices? Yes. But we've also had people sold for higher prices. Why is this? So when we look at the history of slavery, going back to 1809 when slavery was legal, the average person, when adjusted with today's economy and inflation, would have been sold for anywhere between $40,000 to $80,000, right? So that's a big difference. What are some of the factors with that? Well, for one, it was more difficult to move people from place to place in 1809 than it is today. Today, it's very easy to move people from one state to one country pretty quickly. We also have more people than we did in the world at that time. So now people are seen as more disposable. Not to say that people were treated better in 1809, but if you are investing $40,000 to $80,000, you might have a different thought process of what you want to use that individual for versus somebody who's sold at a lower price today. The other thing is, we talk about drug dealers. Often if you're dealing some type of drug, you can only deal that once, right? Where with humans, you can sell them over and over again. That's another reason why we see this industry grow, is because of factors like that. We estimate that there's around 40 to 45 million people enslaved in the world today. It's really hard to have an accurate number on that, but that's what the Global Slavery Index estimates, so that's kind of what we go with. This is also a $150 billion industry annually, so it's generating a lot of revenue. And it continues to be the fastest growing criminal activity. The average age of somebody trafficked is around 12 to 14. Now, can that vary from state to state? Of course. The national average is 12 to 14. We do spend a lot of time in schools, especially that 7th to 8th grade range, of just giving them the tools of what to look for, or how to identify it in their friends or potentially within themselves. 80% of individuals trafficked are female, 50% are under the age of 18. Males are victims of human trafficking as well. I think we often forget about that and just kind of assume it's females that are being trafficked when that's not the case. So going back to why does this exist? Well, a trafficker or a pimp, these stats are specific to sex trafficking, I should say that, can make around $200,000 per individual that they traffic. And on average, they'll have 4 to 6 individuals in what they call their stable. So if you think about that, doing the quick math, if you're making on average $200,000 per person, you're generating a pretty healthy income with that. And that's, again, part of the reason this exists. You have that high demand, low risk, and high profit. So demand, why are we a culture that tolerates it? As we look at human trafficking, we begin to look at things more closely, such as pornography, addiction to pornography, and how can that relate into this category of sex trafficking. And part of the stats that we have come up with, and this is from Pornhub, is over 480,000 sites offer illegal pornography. The average age of first exposure to pornography for boys is 8 to 11. Some people believe it's as young as 6, so that can play a big role as well. I'm not going to read all of that, but porn is also created to be addictive. And porn is a global estimated $97 billion industry, with about $12 billion of that coming from the US. So around 80% of the survivors we work with will tell us that individuals who purchase them for some type of sex act will bring in a photo or a video of something they have seen, and they wanted it recreated. They were either too embarrassed to ask their partner to do that type of activity with them, so that's why they chose to purchase somebody instead. So that's why we say we see this direct correlation between the two. So where is this occurring in the US? This is a map that is ran by the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is also ran by the Polaris Project. So this is where they've received calls or tips on human trafficking. So we'll break that down a little bit more. This map has been updated. The reason I show this one is I like that it has the names of the different cities within North Dakota, so you can really see that human trafficking isn't just happening in larger cities like Bismarck, Minot, Fargo, but also rural communities that have less than 1,500 people. In fact, one of the first cases that were identified in North Dakota was in a small community of less than 1,500 people. So it's important to remember that it's not just a large city issue, but also a rural community problem too. In the video, since we've made that video, the stat has been updated. Since January 1st, 2016, the task force has worked with 345 total victims, 268 adults and 77 minors. Is it possible that there's others out there? Of course, but this is the individuals that the task force has worked with. So if demand is a big reason why things like sex trafficking exist, how do we stop that, right? So when we look at the buyers, one way that we're able to, I guess, stop the buyers is by posting ads on websites, running sting operations within the state. So what you'll notice here is there's an ad from 1829, and into modern day, obviously our ads are generated online today. So that's really where it looks different. So I'll just give you an example of what a sting operation might look like. Well, this actually happened. So this was a case in Williston where law enforcement had put an ad. This is when Backpages was still up. It's no longer up. There's plenty of other sites that are used out there now, but they had put an ad out there. Somebody responded. I believe the ad was for a 14-year-old. The individual was in his early 20s. He knew that this individual was this age. In fact, he went a step further and asked if they had anybody younger. That was the age of 12. And on the other side, the traffickers, law enforcement, said, yes, we do, but she's not ready. You're not going to be satisfied. So how about we just go with this individual, and plus it's cheaper. So they arranged a time and a place to meet the next day. This individual showed up and was arrested. So that's how a sting operation might look. There's 3 different types of stings that can be ran when we talk about human trafficking, or John stings, but that's one example. So with these sting operations, North Dakota created something called the Demand Reduction Program. So this is another way that we're hoping to reduce the demand. So if somebody purchased somebody over the age of 18, they can be sentenced to this class. And basically it helps them to learn what is happening behind the scenes when they choose to purchase that individual. So just wanted to share that is a program that we have in the state to help reduce demand. Because oftentimes what states see is when you start to reduce demand, then you don't have as much human trafficking occurring within the state. So that's what we hope to see here as well. Any questions so far?
So this is all he's gonna get, $500 fine?
So if they purchase over the age of 18, they can get a Class A or Class B misdemeanor, and then they might get the judge might give them an additional fine, but to attend the class is $500. The hope with that $500 is that we would generate enough revenue that it could go back to victim services. Now, I've had buyers go through the class who were part of ads for like a 15-year-old, but they were deemed a low-risk sex offender, and there's not as much programming for low-risk sex offenders, so they've been sentenced to the class, but they did receive a felony and had to register as a sex offender. So we've had instances like that as well. Other questions? Okay. So where do we see trafficking occurring? What industries? In North Dakota, I grew up on a farm, so I'm never trying to say anything negative against the agriculture industry, but we do tend to see more labor trafficking happening in that industry, as well as within construction, domestic servitude, restaurants. We don't necessarily have factories compared to some states here. In terms of sex trafficking, pornography, of course, online, and massage parlors are some of the areas where we've seen it more frequently in the state. Organ trafficking, that's something you may have heard of. Typically how that looks is you will have somebody who's looking for a kidney is the most common trafficked organ, and they will have a broker who will usually go to an underdeveloped area, offer somebody $1,500 to $2,000 for their kidney. If you're somebody who lives in deep poverty and you have absolutely nothing, $1,500 is going to seem like quite a bit of money, and they will have a surgeon or someone who claims to be a surgeon operate, remove that kidney, and then give it to the other individual. Sometimes that other individual knows where it's coming from, sometimes not. But that's an example of organ trafficking. So something you might have heard about, but we really don't know where to categorize it, so it kind of has its own category. Okay, so what are some red flags to look for? Now, I realize not all of you are probably healthcare professionals, I understand that, but I think it's important to note that law enforcement as well as individuals in the medical profession tend to come across human trafficking victims more often than they think. In fact, it's estimated about 87%. So it's good to know what to look for in these type of cases. So what do you think a trafficker is looking for in a victim? Any guesses?
Scared of whoever they're with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can be, yep. Looking for their vulnerabilities. Other guesses? Runaways, isolation, yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Unexplained cause.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all good answers. So often that low self-esteem, lack of social safety net, runaways. What majority of our survivors tell us is one thing that has really stuck out is a desire to be loved. So they felt like they weren't getting that at home or from anywhere else, and they just had a desire to be loved. And that's what their trafficker was able to provide to them in the beginning, of course, for most of these situations. So they just wanted to feel loved. When we talk a lot to youth, something I will tell them too is, when we go online, we post a lot of things about ourselves. Sometimes we might post inappropriate pictures, but sometimes we also share too much information, like, my parents are terrible, I have no friends, or I just don't want to be here anymore. If I'm a trafficker, I'm definitely going to look at some of those things, and I'm going to become your friend, and I'm going to aid you in that conversation by telling you, yes, your parents are terrible and you don't need your other friends. So it's important what we post and who we talk to online, and that's something we really try to stress with our youth. Again, victims can be male or female, any age. Anyone can become a victim of human trafficking, but are there certain factors that can make somebody more susceptible to becoming a victim of human trafficking? Yes, that is true. But again, anyone can fall into that. In terms of trafficker, I think a lot of people, I love asking this question to youth because the question I get often is, it's a man in a white van, right? And we know that that's not always the case, and probably most of the time isn't the case. A trafficker can be your next door neighbor, someone you work with. 50% of people are actually trafficked by people they know. We had a case in Mandan where the father was trafficking his daughter. So those situations can happen. I think we have this misconception that it is this stranger pulling people off the side of the street when that doesn't happen. I mean, can it happen? Of course, but it's not the number one way people are trafficked. So again, just a few what a trafficker profile might look like. And then, of course, like I said, 50% of individuals are trafficked by people they know. So does that surprise anybody? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. So recruitment and control. Where are traffickers doing the recruitment? When we talk to survivors from like the 70s and the 80s, bus stations were one of the main ways that people were actually recruited. Obviously, that has changed since we have the internet. A lot of what we see happening now is people recruited online. But that doesn't mean that people can't be recruited in malls, parties, as well as shelters and group homes. But I would say social media is probably where we see it the most. One example of how that looks like, we had a case here a couple years ago where we had somebody in middle school who was dating a much older individual. And they had met on Instagram, and he, just kept telling her how beautiful she was, and she was also in foster care, so he's trying to take advantage of that as well. Well, one day she gets this random message on Instagram from a modeling agency who said, you're so gorgeous. If you can get out to California, we will have a job for you. And so she went to her boyfriend and said, what do you think of this? Do you think I should do it? And he's like, yeah, and I'll even drive you. You don't even have to tell your foster parents. We'll just take off after school. Don't worry about it. So after school, he was there in front of the school. They left. They were picked up by Highway Patrol outside of North Dakota, and she was brought back here to North Dakota. Who do you think the modeling agency, though, was on Instagram? Him. Yep. So he had several different accounts. So not only was he recruiting people as his boyfriend, but also pretending to be a modeling agency to recruit people too. Now, some people would say, well, you should be able to see through that, but not really. Even as somebody now at this age, if nobody ever gives you a compliment and somebody's suddenly giving you a compliment, that feels good, and you might read into that. And now if you're a 7th or 8th grader and somebody is messaging you that you could be a model, that's probably going to feel pretty good, right? And so it's easy to see why people can be taken advantage in that way. So what are just some general indicators to look for? So something I'll say, especially in youth, or even like not just youth, you'll see this in adults as well. But if you're in a school setting, let's say you have your star student who always attended school, never missed a day, suddenly isn't attending, is always late for functions, seems depressed, sad, but was always outgoing. This can be an adult too. Maybe they were the individual that always got to work on time, bubbly, outgoing. They started dating somebody new, and now you start noticing these different trends happening. Youth, they might all of a sudden have a lot of new items. So they might have a new cell phone, a new computer, new jeans. Where are these items coming from? Asking those type of questions. Traffickers will typically take their victims out of town and sell them that way as well. So you might notice an individual is going to out of town on the weekends quite frequently. We had a case here where a mother had a boyfriend who, at the height of the Bakken, would take her 2 daughters to Williston and sell them that way for sex acts. So when they came back to school, they really struggled in school, and they would act out a lot, and nobody really knew what was going on or what questions should we be asking. So usually Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday were really rough. Thursday was a good day for them, and then Friday, the acting out started again. So just noticing, why has this behavior changed? What are things in this person's life that seem different than before? This individual might not have travel documents or their own identification. Those can also be signs. And I'll break that down a little bit more from sex trafficking and labor trafficking. From a health perspective, malnutrition, dehydration, sexually transmitted diseases, broken bones, those can all be signs. And I know that's really generic because people can exhibit those from various things, but those are just things that we're looking at. Where did you get that bruise from? Where did you get that broken bone from? So sex trafficking specifically, the individual typically has a boyfriend or girlfriend who is quite a bit older, and especially if this person is a high schooler, maybe 16, 17 years old, and they're dating somebody who is in their later 30s, that should be cause for questioning what is going on in that relationship. Constantly has different scars and bruises. They didn't have that before, but since they started dating this individual, they now have these bruises pretty consistently. Again, change in attire, personality, all factors. Tattoos or branding can be a big thing. Just because someone has a tattoo doesn't mean they're a victim of human trafficking, but I'm just going to show you a few examples of what branding has looked like on some of our victims here. But I just want to also share a few terms that you might hear in regards to sex trafficking if you're working with a victim of human trafficking. They might refer to, if pimp is the trafficker, but they might refer to their trafficker as daddy, uncle. So it's really important to understand, are they related, or is there something else going on here? Facilitators, so the reason traffickers are good at what they do is they're able to hire people because they're making so much money, whether it's the hotel industry, even tattoo artists, people that work at nail salons, cosmetologists, to help in their business, essentially. But when we talk about branding, here are just a few examples. It used to be, years ago, barcodes was a big thing. Traffickers were really using barcodes. And part of the reason they brand their victims is because it creates a sense of ownership over that individual. And other traffickers then who might try to step in will see, no, this is my property. Basically, you can't touch my property. Then we saw a lot of names, whether it's in the wrist, in the lip, but it doesn't have to be just in those locations. We've had traffickers. This is one survivor from North Dakota. Her trafficker wrote all his rules, or tattooed his rules on all the individuals that he trafficked on their back. His nickname was Cowboy, so all of his victims also had like cowboy, whether it was a cowboy hat, cowboy shoe, a horseshoe. Those were symbolisms that he used for his type of ownership tattoos. So it might look different per person. Obviously, you can see with the gal up there, her case actually ended up being a federal case. So now he is behind bars, and I'm glad to say that. And I believe he got life. So that was a success there. But that was something that he did to his victims. Something we've had tattoo artists do now is they will step up and volunteer their services, because obviously it can be very difficult to remove a tattoo. So what they'll do is they'll help create something that the survivor chooses. So you might have this horseshoe, but what is something we can design that you chose? So that's something that tattoo artists have been doing, which is one way to help the victim as they heal in this process. When we talk about labor trafficking, things that you'll often see is usually the individual has to pay off some type of debt. So they're constantly like not able to get ahead. They're paid a very low wage, but it's important to recognize too, sometimes you have bad employers, but then sometimes you have bad employers who are traffickers. So that makes our job a little difficult sometimes of determining which one is it. They're usually, like I said, working long hours and cares for children that aren't theirs. So those can be all indicators of potential labor trafficking cases. When I was in Guatemala, we saw a lot of labor trafficking happening within the garbage dumps. So often people would recruit young children, like you see here, to pick up garbage, and then they would sell the garbage because they could make some money off of that. So, of course, I always tell people human trafficking looks different depending where you're traveling, but it's there. Any questions so far? Throwing a lot at you, but please interject anytime. So why don't victims leave? We get that question a lot. And part of that deals with the power and control. And I realize it's hard to see that, so I'm going to break it down a little bit. Oftentimes, it's very difficult for victims to leave because we talk about trauma bonding, Stockholm syndrome, and I don't have enough time to get in depth into those things today. But they will tell their victims false stories. The victim might have had one bad experience with law enforcement or a service provider, and now they're too scared to get help again, or they just don't believe it's worth it because the person may have just thought it was a joke, or that they deserved that they deserved what happened to them. Again, they're usually moved quickly from place to place. That can be a factor too. Sometimes the traffickers will have children with their victims, and they will use the children against them. So if you don't bring in your quota tonight, so that's usually how much you have to make on this day, I'm going to do so-and-so, or we're going to sell this individual or our child to the next person that comes through the door. So that's why it can be very, very tough for victims to leave. And oftentimes at this point, they may have developed some type of an addiction to a drug. That can play a part, or they have lost connection with anybody that they knew before, so they just really don't know where to go. On average, it will take a victim up to 11 to 12 times to really leave their trafficker. So they might visit a shelter 12 times before they really have the strength or courage to leave that person. So it's important to note that. Again, other things, a lot of times our victims, they'll blame themselves as well. And like I said, they may have went to somebody and told them what was going on, and they said they deserved it. And that stuck with them, and they really believed they deserved it. So those can be all factors why it's really difficult for a victim to leave. Other things to note too, if you believe you have come in contact with a victim of human trafficking, general questions you can ask. Can you leave your job if you want to? Can you come and go as you please? If you're working with an individual and they don't speak the language, so if they don't speak English, and the only people around are individuals who can speak English, you can always contact us for a translator. Lutheran Social Services is able to provide that. So either contacting the task force or Lutheran Social Services, we can get you set up with that. But it's important to get that piece in play so you can actually have a fruitful conversation with that individual so you can know what's actually going on as well. Other questions, has your family been threatened? Do you live with your employer? It seems so generic, but just things that you can ask. Now, let's say you are, it's one thing if you're at your job and you come in contact potentially with a victim of human trafficking. There's also the possibility you might be at Walmart or you might be at the grocery store or a gas station and come in contact with a victim of human trafficking. Those are two different scenarios. A lot of times individuals will want to help that person that they see in the grocery store, but we ask people not to do that. If you suspect a case, write down all the details. Did the individual have a tattoo? Did they have a marking? What type of car? If the individual was with who you believe is their trafficker, what vehicle did they get into? What was the license plate? Those things can be really helpful. So that looks different than, of course, if you believe you're working with a client that might be a victim of human trafficking. And if you are, I'm going to give you some numbers to please call in those situations, but if you're engaging with survivors, it's important to know that you can't expect normal behavior. So we have a lot of people who want to volunteer and help us out in human trafficking, and we want volunteers, we really do. But I always tell people, if you're looking for instant gratification, you're not going to get it from these individuals. They have been through a lot, and if that's what you're looking for, that's not going to happen. So might not be the right group for you, but if you're willing to look past that and have a lot of patience, that's what you need when working with these victims. There's also chemical dependency that'll typically follow with a survivor, as well as trauma. Needy, there might be some type of denial. Social workers often tell me that this is the hardest type of client that they've ever worked with. So it can be challenging, but of course, it's worth it to see them come out of this life and be able to live a better one. So just things to keep in mind. It's often difficult for victims to stand in front of a group of people and share part of their story. So we met with a group of victims or survivors and asked them, what are some things that you would want people to know? And here was just a couple of them I'm going to share with you. Think about things from our point of view. Never say you understand because you haven't been there, but still try to put yourself in our shoes. Language counts. The words you use make a difference. Calling us prostitutes hurts us. We may act hard, but we have to have the wall up for survival. Deep down, we know we need help. We need more information about your services, and we need it to be in places where we can see it. So those were just a few of the things that they shared with us, and I always try to make sure to make a point to share that with every group that I speak with. In terms of information, we are working as a task force to create posters and flyers that people can put up in their businesses so people know who to contact if they suspect a case, or even just at a restaurant or a hotel. If a victim is there, they know who to contact as well. So that's hopefully something you'll see in the next couple of months, and if your organization wants that information, we're happy to send that to you as well. So I'm going to wrap up with just the last objective, and that's determine next steps. So the first thing I will stress is education. Yes, you're here today, you're receiving this education, but everyone you work with should receive education on how to identify a victim of human trafficking. It's critical, it's important, and you just never know who is going to be the person to spot it. So it's important that everyone you work with has that education. Whether it is coming to a conference, that's an option, but I also have opportunities for people to take a webinar, or view a webinar, I should say, online. So if that's something you want more information on, I'd be happy to send that to you as well. Have a protocol in place. So what is your plan at the place that you work? If you suspect a case of human trafficking, what is your plan? And something will tell you, if obviously, depending who you work for, you might fall into one of these categories. But of course, in an emergency, we always tell people to call 911. But if you suspect a case but you don't believe it's an emergency, calling your local law enforcement is important. Or you can also report tips to the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force. And we have multiple disciplinary teams around the state that will meet and look at this case. The turnaround, we've been able to look at cases within 24 hours in most areas within the state. So if you suspect a case, we will have somebody there to help with that process. So just know that we're available as a resource, and you can call. Even if you're not sure, we encourage you to call, because at least we can get that individual some type of services. So please know that that is there for you. And then, of course, we also have the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So if you can't remember the other numbers, 911 should be pretty simple. But there's also the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force as well. Or sorry, the National Human Trafficking Hotline that you can contact. And if you don't like to call, you can text. So both of those are options. When I reference webinars, these are 3 different areas you can look at. So the Department of Homeland Security, the Blue Campaign, they have a lot of good material there. The National Human Trafficking Resource Center, and of course, the Polaris Project actually have trainings you can view for free. So that can be a good reference that you can use for the individuals you work with.